Hello, welcome. We are going to start this side event on carbon markets. I will go quickly over the run of show for this morning. Then we will have the words of the Executive Secretary of the Executive Director of the UN Environment Program. But before going into that, this is the agenda for the first part of the event. We will have the welcome and opening remarks of Inger Andersen, Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program. Then we will go over some key messages or trends that we see in the market, and that will be the sense seater for the first panel. In this first panel, we will have representatives from IETA, ICAO. We will have the Ministry of Finance of Brazil. Brazil is launched a coalition in Belém on integrity, conversions of carbon markets. We are going to hear about that. And then we will hear from the African Development Bank on the work in carbon markets. Then during the second part, and we will have a coffee break between these two, Karen Olsen from the Copenhagen Climate Center will tell us all we want to know about Articles 6.2 and 6.4 and more. And then we will go into the second panel of this morning. But before that, we will show you a presentation of allied offsets on financing in carbon markets. That is where the money is coming from, where it is flowing. And then we will go into the second panel of the morning. And in that panel, we will have a very interesting group of people coming from mostly the private sector. M-Search, it is a startup. We will hear from them. Ernst & Young, then the UN Capital Development Fund, and also the Environmental Defense Fund. And finally, closing remarks. So with that, I would like to invite Inger Andersen. She is the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program. Inger, thank you very much.
I hope we can take this photo down. Good morning. Maybe we can put something more interesting at the back. But it's a pleasure to be here this morning, and thank you to everyone who is here. Because this is really important. It's technical, it's complex, but it matters. And every country where I go, they're sort of saying, now that we got Article 6 done, where is the money flowing? And you are here to try to unlock, demystify, and make real that flow of funding. So I really want to speak to a warm welcome to this high-integrity carbon market event, which of course is set within UNEA, and it's no coincidence because at UNEA we do more than negotiate, we connect, we explore, we find synergies, we find solutions. So allow me to start with a little bit of an overview first of where we stand on the issue of climate change. And as you all know, we have made some advances, including through the efforts on financing adaptations and efforts on deforestation at the climate talks just now in Belém. And as I'm talking at Belém, big shout out of thanks and appreciation to our Brazilian friends because they pulled off what was very difficult. They invited us into the gateway of the Amazon and showed us the real challenges that countries are living in a climate changing world. But anyway, the bottom line is that we are, however, off track when it comes to where we need to be on the Paris commitments. And when we take all of our commitments that we made in the NDCs submitted this year, we are still projecting a 2.3 to 2.5 degrees temperature increase by 2100. And that's not the place we promised one another, and it's certainly not a place that we want to be. And so when we look at that then, that multi-decadal likely overshoot of 1.5 seems to be a reality, and that means, therefore, that we have to make extra efforts to bend that curve because every digit of a degree matters. So we need to see rapid and unprecedented cut to our greenhouse gas emissions to make that overshoot temporary and as minimal as we can, and to get on a path limiting overshoot to about 0.3 degrees. If we want that, then we need to cut emissions by 26% by 2035. I'll say that again, 2 degrees, cut by 26% by 2035. But we don't want 2 degrees, actually, we want 1.5. So how much do we need to cut by 2035? 46%. So about half of our emissions today need to go in the coming 10 years or else. So that's the reality that we're facing, and this is why this carbon finance matters so much. Because when we look at the financing that is needed for adaptation, we are talking about 310 to 360 billion per year needed by 2035, 12 times more than where we are. We promised each other, you may recall, in Glasgow, that we would reach 40 billion by 2025 this year. However, we are barely at 25 billion, yes, that's correct. So therefore, we are not anywhere close. And we need to, as we continue as we are, get well over 300 billion by 2035. So there is work to be done. And this is where, if carbon markets are done right, they can take us to scale, they can accelerate, they can mobilize both for mitigation and for adaptation. They can drive innovation, they can force emissions cuts. Carbon markets are, of course, not a silver bullet, but they are a tool in the toolbox and an important tool. They are a critical lever for climate action. So, colleagues, we are seeing accelerating progress in the carbon market, and we celebrate that. There's been decades of work, and countries at COP29, as you all know, agreed to the final building blocks that set out how the carbon markets would operate under the Paris Agreement, making these country-to-country trading and carbon crediting mechanisms fully operational under Article 6.2. These are the cooperative approaches as we know them. And under Article 6.4, this is the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. So these two now are, in theory, up and running. And COP30, of course, built on that and made some significant progress. Inside because now we need to have the gears of these sort of overarching 6.4 and 6.2 agreements. How are the gears going to work? How is the supervision of this thing going to be done? How can we ensure that we have transparency in the system? So in Belém, then, there were some good negotiations and a clear signal that the supervisory body of Article 6.4 should focus on implementation while increasing transparency. So let's get that clear, set the COP. Now, the nature-based credits in Article 6.4, the reality is that they will probably not be available for years, and that is what it is. Article 6.2 is, however, ready to support high-integrity transactions in the nature category. That's important. And so such transaction, of course, now will be subject to increased scrutiny. And it's really important that they are integral, because that will give courage to 6.4 and to the negotiations as we move forward. So we did see very strong calls from developing countries to simplify the rules because it's really complicated, and to reduce the transaction costs because they are heavy. In the spirit of delivering faster, this was the implementation COP, of course, and we need to see more action and ambition. And with those rules, an agreed mechanism, simple doesn't have to mean weak. It can just mean expedited and simple and not as complex as it is. Now, outside the negotiations, we note that Brazil really advanced a proposal for integrating carbon markets, aiming to reduce the fragmentations that we are seeing and to increase transparency by harmonizing the standards, linking carbon credit trading systems, which is very fragmented, as those of you in the know would know. And countries that are part of the coalition to grow the carbon markets, which is an established coalition, they reaffirmed their commitment to high integrity crediting. And meanwhile, market participants announced 1.1 billion worth of investments in November alone, a roughly 40% increase from COP29, with a strong focus on nature. This all builds trends in terms of volume and so on, which we celebrate. Demands in the carbon markets for international aviation, we will hear, I saw from colleagues from that sector, the whole CORSIA conversation continues to surpass the estimates and is approaching a volume of around 160 to 210 megatons of CO2, which is comparable to emissions from Spain and the United Arab Emirates. So that is something we can celebrate. Now, the value of the transactions was in 2024, $535 million, so that's good. 2024, the value of broader financing commitments in the voluntary markets was around, including long-term offtake, was around 16 billion. So yes, it's 18 times larger than the value of that which would be retiring at the same time. So that trajectory underscores and underlines the strategic importance of carbon markets, the voluntary markets, as a complement to the compliance markets and the national climate strategies, and that's good. Investments in adaptation will come from Article 6.4 to the Adaptation Fund, contributions that 6.4 makes at 5% at issuance. And a similar rate is encouraged for the voluntary transactions under 6.2, and anyone who's trading under 6.2, please do consider the Adaptation Fund percentage input in payment. Carbon market integrity, as it continues to improve, participation will broaden, and the shares of the proceeds can become more predictable and more reliable. Ghana, for example, I want to celebrate. They've been a real front runner in this space, allocating a part of the proceeds to implement their national adaptation plan. So what does all of this mean? Well, for countries, there is a confirmation that markets will play an important role in their NDC strategies. We already had 78% of the parties to the Paris Agreement intending to use the Article 6 mechanism, signaling a widespread adoption of the market-based approaches. And this is continuously growing. For investors, it means that the integrity requirements are tightening, with demands continuing to shift to high-quality credits that demand a premium price. And that's something that is good. High-integrity, nature-based credits will remain attractive, not only because of their climate impact, for example, the Amazon transitioning to savanna, there's some real climate opportunities for investments here, but also because of their non-carbon benefits, such as the biodiversity return, local livelihoods returns, water, rainfall reliability returns due to the biomass sustained, etc., etc. But friends, what we're seeing, though, is that as the carbon markets are set to grow fast, we have to prioritize governance, transparency, and high integrity, and access, nevertheless, to those who have the hardest time to enter into this market. That's not easy, because governance and transparency and integrity would usually make a lot of rules, and access to a country that is hard of entry is complex. So we have to think about what simplification really means while ensuring we have integrity. The truth is that when I go and visit countries, often they're saying, where is that money they all promised? That carbon money. We have our forests, we have our regeneration, we have this, we have that. And there is not the full understanding in many of these countries, and I'm talking from Somalia to Senegal, across those countries that are struggling. I'm talking about countries that may not be the first port of entry for these resources. I'm talking about countries that thought that these monies would land with them. How can we support them? I think this is part and parcel of what we have to do while we enhance the governance, the transparency, and the integrity. Because if we cannot ensure access to those who need it the most, what use is this? So that's why we need to ensure that the carbon markets are both locally and globally connected. Indigenous people, local communities, countries that may be considered marginal in one way or the other to something like a trading regime like this have to be engaged and involved. And we have to find ways on ensuring that they too can get those benefits. And at the very same time, the voluntary and compliance markets must converge at scale to achieve that scale. Fragmentation that we are seeing right now increases the transaction cost, makes the cost of entry for countries that may be struggling with systemic issues nearly impossible. So colleagues, against this complex landscape, you are here having this discussion. And I want to give you my assurance that we from UNEP, we are totally committed to working on ensuring that trust and that transparency. We've established inside UNEP a carbon market cluster where we have folks who are specialists from across our UNEP landscape. And we are supporting a number of countries to engage with Article 6 and COSIA to establish domestic compliance mechanism and access voluntary carbon markets. We also collaborate, of course, with the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. Now, with the developments we saw under COP30, we at UNEP expect greater demand, as I just mentioned, for the support. And I think you can expect our support to be commensurate with the potential opportunities, but the constraints engaging in the carbon markets remain real, and we have to find a solution to get through that. So in conclusion then, carbon markets cannot deliver net zero alone, but as I said, they are an important tool in the toolbox, and they can help us drive the decarbonization needed. They can help us move money towards energy, towards industry, towards transport, towards nature, obviously. But carbon markets can move us in the right direction on mitigation as well as adaptation, and thereby also enhancing other development needs and other environmental needs. That is why we have to work on governance, transparency, and integrity standards, and simplification for access to maximize the impact. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Inger. Much appreciated. And with that setting and welcoming remarks, we will continue. Next slide. Oh, sorry, I have control over this. Important, as we go through the panels and the presentations, here we have a QR. If you have questions, you can put them in online. We will still go the old way of passing the mic for those that do not want to use this, but it's an option. Okay, as I mentioned, before we go into the first panel, we wanted to quickly go over some basic ideas or basic messages that we would like you to keep while we have these discussions. One is what Inger was saying, there is a need for rapid mitigation action. And Inger actually was mentioning an overshoot of, as we go, we would get into 2.3, 2.8. That's really not good. So the graph in the middle is basically showing that. I mean, we are going to overshoot. There is no question. The real question now is, how bad this overshooting will be. And it does matter because there is sometimes the perception in the discussion in carbon markets that time is on our side. Fine, we will overshoot, and then we will go back. It's just a matter of taking CO2 out of the air. That's a bit like, thinking as if carbon markets can work and the rest of the climate system is sort of static, will not change. But that's actually not the case. Carlos Nobre, I was quite surprised. This is from the Financial Times. Carlos Nobre is from Brazil. He's a researcher of impeccable credentials. And basically what he was saying is that, well, we are seeing those signals of the Amazon tipping into a savanna. I will not go into that, but it's because of the changes in the rainfall patterns brought by deforestation. And we see some signs that this can happen. If that were to happen, then we will get the release of the equivalent of about 20 years of emissions from China. I'm not going to say that that would be game over, but it will be really a challenge to do carbon capture and storage of this magnitude. So the climate system is not static, it is dynamic, and it can tip, so time is important. So now, going into carbon markets. Well, first big message is that carbon pricing mechanisms, the use of them is growing. About 80 emission trading systems covering 28% of global emissions and generating about $100 billion in revenues that these systems recycle into financing decarbonization pathways. It is not only that they are growing, but they seem to have a significant potential. Article 6, well, true, it has just started, but there are signals that countries will use it. 6.2 already has about 200 million tons of demand coming between now and 2030. CORSIA, we will hear from our colleague working in CORSIA. CORSIA is driving another 200 million tons probably by 2027, end of 2027. And the voluntary carbon market, we will go a bit over that. Well, there's a huge range of estimations, but all of them point to significant growth in the next 5 to 10 years. Now, for countries, if there are country delegates and you are thinking about 6.2, when we were showing Article 6 and CORSIA, these two need something called corresponding adjustment, which is basically have the accounts clear in your own countries vis-a-vis the NDC. Well, what we see is that there is a significant price premium for those countries that do corresponding adjustment. Guyana, for example, at 22.5, that almost double the price of the same credit in the voluntary carbon market. Similar things when we go to clean cook stoves using gold standard, and a bit less, but it's still a price premium for water filtration. Again, this is just examples, but you put, basically the message is you do a corresponding adjustment, there is a price premium. It's true, we hear all the time, be careful about how much you do. You don't want to sell what you don't have. True, NDC adjustment, but when you do it, there is a price premium. Now, this is something important, and we will ask Andrea here in the panel a bit about it. But there is a reset. That's another important message happening in the voluntary carbon market. I'm not going to go too much in detail, but those two graphs, basically the one at the top is telling you the number of credits that are being generated, and you can see that they are going down. That is basically because of the effect of a reduced supply in RED+. There was a huge problem with integrity, and that part of the market is kind of recalibrating. But the graph at the bottom is telling you retirements. That basically means that somebody that bought a credit and cancel it. Nobody else can use that credit. You cannot sell it in the secondary market. You can't do anything about it. It's just canceled. And you can see that is steady. So what it is telling you basically are those messages on the left. Companies have not abandoned the voluntary carbon market. They are still there. The market is undergoing a quality reset. It's not a collapse. And nature-based solutions remain central to the voluntary carbon market, and the market is looking for better integrity and more quality. So let's continue. And this is a bit of more information about this same message, is that the market is not static, but we will hear from Aita the opinion about that. The market is moving towards greater quality. And there are some good reasons about it. Well, the graph on the left, those bars in green, well, actually those are credits issued under methodologies that have been assessed as of high integrity in the ICBCM. This is the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets. It's a very long name. But basically what these folks do is to evaluate different methodologies and pass judgment about which ones are okay and which one needs a bit of improvement. And what you see is that this is coming from Calix Global. This is a credit rating agency. That you see a move to the left, meaning that actually there is higher quality in these credits. And on the right, what you see is the price premium. And this is the price premium in this case by co-benefits. These are credits that do not only provide you with strong carbon quantification, but on top of that, they may provide you with benefits like ecosystem services, support to communities, so on and so forth. Well, these credits are actually getting way better prices in the market. Supply side conversion is key, and Christina will tell us a bit more about it. As Inger was saying, the market is fragmented. It's like going with my laptop to Kenya, and I have to plug it into the socket here, and it's different than the socket in Brazil. The one in Europe is even worse than that because you don't have the same voltage. This is actually what we see in the markets today. So supply side, meaning that what goes into the market more or less has similar quality, is important. And the same from the other side of the table, which is demand side conversion. How carbon credits should be used and for what purposes. And there are a number of initiatives at the international level, supranational, national, and subnational that are converging slowly. Way slower than what we would like this to happen, but conversions nonetheless. And finally, this is the final slide. This is what we do at UNEP. We support implementation of Article 6, and Karen will tell us a bit about this. We work a lot on something that matters to us, which is increasing the integrity of the voluntary carbon market. Without integrity, the market will simply not scale up. Nobody will buy things that you believe is not worth what you are paying for. Or worse, that you will end up on the front page of a news outlet because of bad quality or whatever. So we support countries in the application of best standards by credit categories. We participate, again, in helping countries access domestic and international VCM transactions. And something that is also important is that some of the compliance schemes in countries are accepting a fraction of credits for offsetting purpose as well. Again, the quality of this credit is key, particularly if you want to link these markets with markets in other countries. So with that, let me invite the first panel to come to the front. Andrea Abrahams, she is the Managing Director for the voluntary carbon markets at AITA. Andrea, thank you very much for coming and being with us. Then we have Chinga Mashetisi, and I hope this time I pronounced the name right. Chinga, thank you so much. Chinga is a regional officer at ICAO. ICAO is the International Civil Aviation Organizations of the United Nations. She is based in Nairobi, and she supports 24 member states in the implementation of ICAO standards and CORSIA. We have Cristina Reis from Brazil. Thank you so much, Cristina. Cristina is serving as the extraordinary secretary for the carbon markets within the Ministry of Finance in Brazil. She has probably 2 or 3 roles into one, but in summary, she is overseeing the establishment of the Brazilian domestic carbon market, and she is also leading the discussion on an initiative to integrate, support the conversions of international compliance mechanisms. And finally, Dr. Olufunso Samorin. Thank you so much, Olufunso, for being with us. He's the regional climate head at the African Development Bank, and he leads at the bank the climate change and green growth program. So, again, remember this code. If you have questions, you can try this. If that doesn't work, let us know and we will pass you the mic at the end. Andrea, since I have you the closest to the... Who doesn't have a mic? Okay, perfect. Andrea, the voluntary carbon market had a few rough years, to put it mildly, and that shows on the charts in terms of volume trading, etc., etc. A lot of questions on integrity, some of them difficult to respond. So my question to you is that, in your view, how has the voluntary carbon market reacted to this? Or is it reacting? Is it going the right way? I mean, the slides I was showing on the screen, you would agree with them, or there is more to say?
So I think you captured it very well when you called it a reset. I think that's a really good way to think about it. And in fact, I really loved what Inga said as well. It's technical, it's complex, but it matters. So yes, there's no denying it's been difficult. We were facing such a good time in 2021. Everything was going in the right direction. It really looked like the market was going to grow significantly, and a lot of new players, new initiatives, new innovation entered the market. But at the same time, so did the challenges. And they were broadcast very widely through the press. And they were primarily, and still remain in some instances, supply-side issues, a concern about the actual quality of the unit. If you can't be really sure that that credit that you're buying represents 1 ton of carbon removed or avoided, then you have a problem. especially if you're using that 1 ton credit to compensate for 1 ton emitted, and you're wanting those two to balance each other out. So it was a real issue and made everybody very, very concerned. What made it even more difficult to understand is that this market is so disaggregated. There are thousands of projects dotted across hundreds of countries following hundreds of different methodologies. So how do you know that finding one bad project in one country translates into a problem everywhere? So it was incredibly difficult to really address the issue and get to grips with it. So there's a lot being put in place to work on that, and we can talk lots more about that. But it has had a very numbing effect on the market. What it's also done is really impact demand. And actually, it's a demand-led market. The carbon market is a demand-led market. Those initiatives you were talking about, Corsair is a demand initiative. Article 6.2 trading is demand. Corporates buying carbon credits is demand. So what are those sources of demand, and how are they being impacted, or why, where are they right now with the challenges? So in the voluntary carbon market, demand comes from corporates. Corporates buying credits to use in their climate strategies. If you're a corporate and you are concerned about what you're buying, you're concerned that you may be accused in the press that that activity that you're taking on could end up taking you to court because you've made a claim about something you think you're doing. You could be doing it with really good integrity, but actually you still can be taken to court. Why are you going to do it? Why are you going to do it? So companies have got very, very nervous about the state of things, and the language we use to talk about that is safe harbor. How do you make sure that companies can participate in the carbon market in a way that is safe? What are the mechanisms that you need to put in place to create that safe harbor for those companies? So that's the work that's undergoing, and I can talk lots more about that, but maybe I should pause now, if you like, because there's lots of initiatives underway.
Thank you, Andrea. But if you were to respond in a few seconds, is the market reacting?
So the market is definitely reacting. This is the encouraging thing. Initiatives came up to, first of all, address the supply side. You mentioned it, Gabrielle, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, but also the crediting programs really upped their game in terms of making sure that their methodologies are robust and that they can be assessed by the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. So now what you have is, going back to a point I made right in the beginning, it's difficult to see what good looks like. Now you can see what good looks like because it has a label on it. It's a label that says it's a CCP labeled credit, or it's a Corsair credit. You can now see, you can assess as a buyer what good looks like. So that's incredibly helpful. The part that we're working on, and it needs more work, is still around the safe harbor and the demand side. And I think if we have time, we should talk more about that because it really is important. That's where the finance is coming from, so we have to get that part right.
Thank you. Yes, and continue with this idea of demand, then I would like to turn to you, Chinga. I think that I'm not exaggerating by saying that if we didn't have Corsair in place at the moment, we would have a very different picture of the state of carbon markets. And as Inger was saying, the demand for the next couple of years in Corsair will probably rival that of the emissions of Spain. So my question to you is that, could you give us an update of where we are in CORSIA, and in your view, what has been the impact of CORSIA on the other corners of this market?
Thank you, Gabriel. And thank you so much as well for the good introduction. In your slides, it was quite exciting to see all the work that we have been doing within ICAO. And as Gabriel mentioned, if you can allow me just to give a brief introduction of who we are. I'm from the International Civil Aviation Organization, and we're a UN specialized agency. And within the ICAO, we have a number of objectives. We are going to actually change them to goals coming from January 2026. But one of them is on environmental protection. And one of the things that we look at in environmental protection is the CORSIA. CORSIA stands for Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. And I'd just like to draw your attention to the I part, is for international aviation. So all the discussions that we're going to be talking about today are concerning international flights. So in terms of CORSIA, CORSIA was launched during one of our assemblies. We do our assemblies in Montreal, our headquarters in Canada. And CORSIA was launched and agreed upon by ICAO and the member states, and it became effective in 2019. So during 2019 and 2020, we were looking at monitoring and reporting and verification, just gathering data from the airlines through our member states, and then deciding on a baseline that we would look at and say this is going to be our carbon neutral growth as from 2020. But we all know what happened with COVID. COVID came, and then within the next assembly that we held, it was agreed that from 2024, we are now going to set our baseline as 85% of 2019 emissions. So a lot of has been going on in terms of growth in CORSIA since 2019. And when you look at some of the key design features of CORSIA, it includes a phased implementation, where implementation is done in cycles. And from our airlines, they can either use sustainable aviation fuels or purchase emissions units from the carbon markets, which is the discussion of today. And within this CORSIA, we have what we call implementation elements. So we have a whole implementation element on CORSIA emissions units, which looks at what is the criteria that we need to consider for an emission unit that is going to be purchased by an airline to be considered under CORSIA. So airlines cannot just purchase emissions units from anywhere. They have to be approved by the ICAO Council. Our council is made up of 36 of our member states, and this council created an independent body that we call a technical advisory body, TAB. So the TAB has experts from our member states that assess these programs for consideration under CORSIA. And to date, and like I mentioned, CORSIA is done in phases. So we had the pilot phase from 2021 to 2023. And during that pilot phase, ICAO Council approved 11 programs. And in the first phase, 2024 to 2026, which we are in now, the ICAO Council approved 8 programs to be used by airlines. And also, in addition, in the next compliance cycle, 2027 to 2029, which is under the second phase, 4 programs have been approved to date. And when we look at these developments in terms of approving, the criteria that we have also covers a lot of things like avoidance of double claiming, issuance, or looking at the integrity, etc. And in addition as well, when you look at these developments in ICAO, how do they link to Article 6? So what happens is when a program has been approved by the ICAO Council, we make this information publicly available on our website so that when it comes to cancellation time, any airline that is interested in cancelling these emissions units, they go on our website and identify those emissions units and which programs they can purchase from. But being listed on the ICAO website doesn't mean that when an airline purchases the emissions units, automatically you are eligible for cancelling. The state under that program has to issue a letter of authorization, which also talks to the Article 6. So from ICAO side, we've been really promoting and encouraging our member states to issue letters of authorization to ensure that when it comes to cancellation of these emissions units in 2028, at the end of the compliance cycle, airlines will be able to go and purchase emissions units from states that have issued letters of authorizations. And as also indicated in the slide by Gabriel, you also saw that to date, we have one state that is issued a letter of authorization to talk to the ministers of transport, for them to liaise with the other ministries, the relevant ministries in their countries, so that letters of authorizations are used. I think I'll just stop here. Thank you.
The letter of authorization that Shinga was referring to is part of this process of doing the corresponding adjustment. That was the slide we were showing on the screen, and that is where the price premium is. And actually, Corsia is very much responsible for that price premium. Now, Christina, going back to you, just fresh from COP30, and we have Brazil that in the run-up to COP30 start to put these final touches to the domestic compliance market in Brazil, which you are responsible for. And then the country goes a step further in launching a coalition to do something that will be key to achieve scale. So I would like to ask you, what is that about? We have read a bit on the news, but we were waiting for you to let us know.
Nice. Thank you, Gabriel. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the invitation to the Minister of Finance in your name, in the name of Micaela, in this open and fresh air, very nice discussion. Good morning, bom dia. Thank you all for coming. It's nice to see at 9 o'clock these places, crowd, and surrounded by, I don't know what it means here in Kenya, but it looks like dream filters, as we say in Brazil, those two round things. And it's very nice, the idea that here we have the freedom to talk about how to improve the environment agenda in order to really avoid the rise of the temperature that both Inga and Gabriel had spoken about. So we have a very, very difficult challenge, and we've been talking about this for years. And this year, during the Brazilian presidency of COP30 in Belém, we had promised that we would advance with implementation agenda, and there was this huge action agenda with 30 items to be discussed, complex items. And the Ministry of Finance, together with the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Brazil, we had some key priorities, right? And one of those priorities was precisely the Open Coalition for Compliance Carbon Markets. But let me explain why did we start to talk about this? Because Brazil still is starting to implement its own ETS, its own emission trade systems that was approved last year in December on a new law that was negotiated with the parliament for more than 10 years. So Brazil was talking about integrating carbon markets, and when we didn't have our own compliance carbon markets, was a kind of weird thing that started during the New York Climate Week in 2024. And then we started talking to countries, to entities, to the private sector, nationally and internationally, and there was this common feeling that fragmentation is rising, the carbon border adjustments are coming, especially the European one, and this, of course, would jeopardize investment and trade flows, and the methodologies for carbon accounting, the methodologies for monitoring, reporting, verifying systems, and the methodologies for offsets are all different. So what do we do in this scenario? So the idea was, let's talk about it. There are many forums talking about this. There is huge knowledge accumulated. How we put this together politically, we need the leaders to agree that carbon markets are important and that we have to improve the interoperability between, in this case, precisely compliance carbon markets, direct carbon pricing, both by tax or by emission trade schemes. So Gabriel has shown there are more than 80 countries with some sort of direct carbon pricing. How do we make them communicate to each other? So this was our needs. We needed to talk about this during the Brazilian COP presidency. It's something that we couldn't avoid, right? So the Ministry of Finance has put this as a priority together with the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, which was something very important as well. And the other thing that has the same idea behind, which is the super taxonomy, the interoperability between sovereign taxonomies, another issue that we need to improve. Otherwise, those countries with taxonomy will not communicate as well. So, okay, we started to launch this initiative, but the way that the objectives of this were not clear to anyone, not even for us in the beginning, to be very honest, because the ambitions were too different and they would vary among stakeholders, let's say. And then it took us many, many weeks and months to really decide what this would be about. And this decision was based on dialogue, lots of dialogue. So we had this activation group to dialogue, official one in the action agenda of COP30 presidency, but we were also dialoguing while we were planning our own ETS implementation. And then I realized that to launch an open coalition would be already a very good deliverable of COP30, and we needed to work towards this and to agree on what would be the substance of the coalition. And then we could agree on the substance that Inger has mentioned, which is talking about methodologies of carbon accounting, methodologies of MRV systems, and methodologies of offsets. We could not agree on wording like mutual recognition. You that are negotiating here, you know how difficult it is to agree on mutual recognition, but at some point we're going to have to have mutual recognition. We have to build up mutual recognition somehow, always respecting national differences, sovereign sustainable development choices, and common but differentiated responsibilities, and so on. So all those wordings were very difficult during the negotiation of the declaration, but finally we could make a single and simple declaration that was talking about this substance, that is talking about interoperability. And firstly, the European Union and China agreed and endorsed this declaration together with Brazil. And then when we shared the agenda of the summit, the Leaders Summit in Belém, the delegations, the members were invited to endorse the declaration as well. It was an open call. So it's not about a climate club. It's not a club idea. It's an idea of cooperating together, of strengthening Article 6, the Paris Agreement, and strengthening multilateralism. And then we were a bit surprised, I can say, when we received 18 endorsements from different countries and regions, from different continents. And we had this first meeting in Belém on the 15th, during the finance days. And this was very nice. The meeting was quite, we were all feeling very happy after the meeting. That's why I was mentioning the dream filters. It was like we were surrounded by dream filters and we could talk about important things there and how we would avoid protectionism and how we would work together. So luckily, this was a nice start. After the meeting, we got more 3 endorsements. We are 21 countries and regions now in the open coalition that is being developed. There'll be a meeting the day after tomorrow, with focal points to talk about the governance. And I cannot say how is going to be the governance, which will be the action plan, because Brazil doesn't want to draft this alone. We want to do this collectively, together. It's a difficult pathway, but we really believe that when everybody is working together since the beginning, and this brings legitimacy to the process. So we're going to build up this together. That's why I don't have so many answers now, but I can say that at least we have a common objective.
Thanks so much, Cristina. I have several questions, but I'll get back to you. Just as a note, I mean, what Brazil is trying to do is extraordinary. It's like, I mean, sometimes the conversation on carbon markets get focused exclusively on ambition, on pushing the ambition. And that's fine. We need to do that. But in that conversation, what we lose is that one of the main features of carbon markets is to minimize the global cost of mitigation. I mean, achieving that level of ambition at a minimum cost. And that was always important, but in the current geopolitical environment, I think that will take an even greater importance in this discussion. And what Brazil is trying to do is actually to put enabling conditions to make that happen. But let me go back to that in a while. Olufunso, let me now turn to you. You know, when I came to Africa to work, a dream that took me a while to accomplish, I was amazed by the level of activity that you see in carbon markets. It was really refreshing, and I saw a lot of innovation. I see a lot of innovation just happening. Now, when I talk to all these market participants, they tell me, well, yeah, one of the limiting factors is finance. So, by chance, you're coming from the African Development Bank. So I would like to ask you what the bank is doing in terms of financing, expanding carbon markets, and how successful you are.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Good morning, everyone. And it's a very interesting question because the first statement you made when you came into Africa about the level of interest in carbon market, if you probably came in about 15 years ago, in the Kyoto era, it probably would have been different. Because as much as there was an opportunity for Africa, we didn't really take advantage of that. So there's a wave of interest that we have seen in Africa. And in fact, at AFDB, when you look at across all the NDCs, all African countries have mentioned carbon market as a potential source of revenue, possibility of financing their NDCs. So there's a shift away from what happened during the Kyoto era, which was relative failure for Africa, compared to a significant interest in carbon market in the Paris Agreement era. But the question then is why? Why is Africa all of a sudden interested in carbon market? I think there are 2 points to that. First, the fact that as we speak today, this continent needs, on average, about $280 billion annually to be able to invest in climate adaptation, but also on climate mitigation. It's an investment opportunity, and we've seen that across some of the ambitious NDCs. But what the continent gets is barely $52 billion. So you need $280 billion annually, you only get about $52 billion. That's roughly about 18% of the need. And now when you go deeper, when you unpack that, then you also find out that compared to the rest of the world, where of the total climate flows and private sector, private finance, was constituting about 45 to 50%, in Africa, it was just 18%. So when you combine that together, that there's a bit of a gap between the demand and supply of finance to respond to climate change on the continent, and also the fact that private capital was not finding its way, then you begin to appreciate the entry point for carbon finance. Because what carbon market does, and I agree with what Inga said at the beginning, it is just a tool. When you think about the toolbox of finance, carbon market is one of them. And it will be a missed opportunity for Africa not to be part of it. In fact, when you aggregate all of the current credit, whether in the voluntary carbon market or the compliance market on the continent, they only represent 2% of the continent's potential annually. So there's a massive gap of opportunities for this continent to be part of this global mitigation agenda, and particularly in the carbon market. And the consciousness of that opportunity is beginning to push a new narrative, new interest, and ultimately new partnerships to support countries. So this is where, for the bank, it's been very important for us to continue to play the role that we play as one of the biggest climate finance provider on the continent. About 5 years ago, we committed to $25 billion by 2025. 2020 to 2025. And I'm happy to report to you, by the end of next week, the bank would have reached about $24 billion out of 25 over the last 5 years in climate finance. We've been very aggressive. We've been very interested in adaptation, and we've been pushing a lot in adaptation, but obviously as well recognizing and embracing the opportunity in mitigation. So what we've done in the last few years around carbon markets is largely three things. The first one is we realized that we need a new African coalition to support carbon market investment on the continent. The coalition will need to push new thinking around policy frameworks. The coalition would need, and they're already doing that, new thinking around institutional capacity building, but also helping countries to understand what will it take, managing transactions, but also project development on the ground. So together with some of you who are here, and I see a lot of faces here, we're working together to build that partnership to support a lot of African countries. I don't think we've not done badly, but we can do better with that. The second thing, again, is to begin to experiment with blended finance. So for us in AFDB, we've actually created a window within an energy facility that can look into carbon finance and clean cooking, to be able to build the body of knowledge around how to use concessional capital to be able to crowd in private capital and drive investment in carbon finance, particularly in carbon projects, particularly in sectors where those projects on their own without carbon revenue, they may not be investment ready, or they may not be considered to be bankable in a way. So that thinking, it's very important. The last part, it's what we're currently doing, and I think some of you may be aware. The bank is now creating a dedicated facility, demand-driven, dedicated facility. We're looking at an initial capitalization of about $100 million that can help to support countries in their carbon market engagement and inclusive implementation. So with this dedicated facility, we call it Africa Carbon Support Facility, ACSF, we are doing two things. The one is a window for upstream work. I think we need to really narrow down on readiness, market readiness in Africa, the institutional systems needed, the digital infrastructure that is needed, the policy framework that can crowd in private capital. So we need to take this concept of enabling environment beyond just a fancy word into what will it take for it to happen. And the good thing is we've got some very good cases on the continent. I mean, we always talk about Ghana. We talk about what Senegal is doing. We're beginning to see what other countries are doing. But we need to move beyond those few cases to other countries that have got huge potential. DRC, Tanzania, Nigeria, and the likes. So the upstream window of the facility will be able to support a lot of that work. The second part is a step further. If you have a perfect enabling environment and perfect policy framework, but it cannot get into project development on the ground. You cannot have project developers at scale and support them in meeting the transaction cost involved in that. Then you at best, you keep talking about how well you're ready, but your readiness is just about institutional readiness, not really about program development. So the second part of our facility is looking into downstream investment and be able to crowd in critical mass of project developers on the continent, across scales, across sectors, and who can ultimately take the step forward and be part of this. So this is what the bank is doing. It's learning by doing. We're working with a lot of other MDBs and also a number of African institutions. And we're hoping that at some point we'll look back and we can see the progress that the continent is making within a short period of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, I really want to re-emphasize the beautiful surprise of seeing so much activity in Africa. African companies, African technology, and having the feeling that with just a bit of help, okay, that ecosystem could scale up significantly. So I'll get back to you with a bit more of that. But let me go back to you, Andrea, and I got the impression from your response that about how the voluntary market reacted that, well, yeah, really, really rough years, but it seems to have survived, okay? Let's put it that way. Okay, fine. But then in the years ahead, yeah, what are those things that you would like to see in the voluntary carbon market, let's say to invite you next year, and then your answer is that, no, I mean, now, it's just, now we'll grow steadily, systematically for the next few years. What are those things that you would like the market to pay attention to?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I hope just by the conversations, we've had here, you can start sensing the excitement and the momentum in this market. So why are there reasons to be excited and sort of keep in the game? I think, first of all, it's actually a very resilient market because a lot of the players who have been there since Kyoto days are still participating. So it's a very resilient market. I would say to everybody, keep match fit. Don't back out and say, we'll come back when it's all fixed, because you need to keep sort of skin in the game because this is all moving quite fast. And if you want to be a part of it, you've got to be building your capacity and your knowledge. Now, let's just sort of go through some of those things that are evolving. I think the first one, if you spoke about the voluntary carbon market sort of 20 years ago or 15 years ago, it was a very niche activity for corporates only. That's not the case anymore. Today, there are more and more markets which are linking. So let's take one example. If you're a project developer in South Africa, you can sell your carbon credits into a compliance scheme, the tax scheme. You can then also sell your credits internationally into the voluntary carbon market. You could, if South Africa could authorize credits, sell it into 6.2. You could, if South Africa could authorize for CORSIA, sell it into CORSIA. So suddenly, one project developer has got optionality. As Funso will tell you, that's very attractive for project developers. That's the kind of thing that brings finance in. So that we think we talk now more about a verified carbon credit, which can be sold into multiple different schemes, of which one of those schemes is the voluntary carbon market. So it's a different way of looking at it now. The other thing that is definitely starting to make progress is standardization in a multiple of ways. Again, as Inga said, it's a complicated market. We need to simplify it. That's happening, but it'll take time. On the demand side in particular, it's so important for that corporates, as I mentioned before, can use credits with confidence in their climate net zero strategies. There's work undergoing by the Science Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, and the ISO. They're not going to land quickly, but they are underway, and there's definitely room for hope that this will be resolved. Interoperability of data, you mentioned the G20 work. It's really important that there's read across. So if you've got all these different multiple systems, the data, the way data is recorded in one place, it must be recorded the same in another place. The way you define and definitions in one place need to be the same as another way. The way you count carbon emissions in one jurisdiction, you need to count them the same in another jurisdiction. The way you report them has to be transparent and consistent so that you can operate and transact internationally. These are all important mechanisms that are underway. Investor tools are improving. So 5 years ago, you didn't have rating agencies. Now you've got rating agencies. Again, when you say, how do you point to what good looks like? CCP credits, but rating agencies. You can find credits that are A class rated or B class rated. You can make a decision as an investor about what your portfolio needs to look like in terms of the rating and the quality of those credits. That information is very useful for investors. Insurance products weren't there a couple of years ago. Now we've got various tools and ways that you can insure against risk. So there are all these multiple systems. I just want to mention two more, Gabriel, really important. Government regulation, the legislation around what you can do in a particular country is so important for investment. If you don't know what the rules of the game are, and I work as a chair on investment committee on a fund that invests in carbon market, do you know what concern it causes if you don't know whether that country is suddenly going to charge 2%, 3%, 4% for issuance fees, for various costs to operate in that country? That gives you massive uncertainty as an investor. So we need to know the rules of the game from countries, what the costs are, whether there's a centralized registry, whether credits are, whether you are free to trade, which credits go into 6.2, which can go into the voluntary carbon market. Those strategies from countries are very important. And then finally, I want to mention coalitions, because you've both spoken about coalitions. This shows real bottom-up development of activity. Countries wanting to get together to say we believe in compliance markets. There's also the coalition to grow carbon markets. Kenya is one of the founders, together with Singapore and the UK. This is a coalition standing together to say we advocate for the role that carbon markets can play, including voluntary carbon markets. We've got a shared set of rules and principles that need to be followed. Please join us. These things are very influential and very, very helpful. Let me pause there, but I hope that gives you a sense of a market that is really incredibly dynamic and very much moving in the right direction.
Thanks, Andrea. And actually, you are making my job easier, because one of the questions I got was, what is preventing carbon markets from meeting climate targets? So I could take your response and then flip it and say, well, these are the things we would like to see to have the BCM expanding. Now, if I could go back to you, Chinga, and I am getting questions here on my phone. I wanted to ask you about, for CORSIA, what are the emerging issues you see in the next few years? So far, so good. CORSIA is the engine of demand at the moment. It's setting a pathway, yeah? So I would like to ask you about, what are those issues you see as emerging, things that Corsia has to keep an eye on if it will continue to grow. And in answering that question, I want to ask you whether ensuring that when you evaluate carbon credits for inclusion in Corsia, okay, you maintain consistency in quality. That's a question we got from the audience. I think that is a valid one. Yeah, what Andrea was saying, Tony.
Thank you for that. Okay, yeah. Allow me to start with a question from the audience regarding the assessment of the programs. So, like I mentioned, we do have a body, a technical advisory body, which we call TAB, T-A-B. And this body is made up of experts from our member states. So we do have specific criteria that we look at, and the things that the audience is asking about in terms of integrity, program design of that program that is applying. In terms of the carbon credits, we have specific criteria that the TAB will look at and do the assessment. And we do consider all the things that include integrity, etc. And then in addition to that, I also want to highlight that this TAB, they actually do a call for applications for programs to apply for COSIA at the beginning of each year, usually during the first quarter. So early 2026, ICAO will be putting out the call for applications for programs to apply. And the assessment is only done at program level, not project level. And in addition to the future of COSIA, I did mention earlier on that COSIA became applicable in 2019, 1st of January 2019. And the agreement during the ICAO Assembly was that COSIA would continue up to 2035, playing its role for us to meet our goal of carbon neutral growth for 2020. But one thing that also happens is that there's also what we call a periodic review. So every 3 years, we review the COSIA. So this year, ICAO had an assembly in 2022, end of September, early October. So COSIA was reviewed. So the future of COSIA will include all those periodic reviews. They'll be ongoing every 3 years. And in 2032, we are going to have a special assembly to review, if I can call it in quotes, the fate of COSIA. What is going to happen to the COSIA? Are we going to continue it after 2035? Or are we going to redesign it? Is it going to start contributing to our long-term aspirational goal for international aviation for 2050? What is going to happen? And within COSIA, allow me also to mention that COSIA is one of 4 elements that we look at when it comes to addressing international civil aviation emissions. So COSIA is a complementary measure. And the challenges that we see in terms of COSIA, when you look at the acronym COSIA, we have the R part, which is talking about the reduction. And this reduction is being done using sustainable aviation fuels. There's a lot of work that we are also doing in terms of that. So COSIA covers the fuels part, it covers the emissions units part. So for the fuels part, we are looking into, are our member states ready to start producing sustainable aviation fuels for airlines to use? And then at the same time, for the emissions units part, we are looking at, are member states going to be issuing the required letters of authorizations? We continue to encourage member states to do so, and at the same time, we also encourage programs to submit their applications every year when we do this regular call for applications. I will pause here. Thank you.
Thank you, Shinga. And the question on how you evaluate methodologies is because CORSIA has been very influential in setting a baseline, a high bar for quality. I mean, you can get better, but actually CORSIA is now becoming like, I mean, this is the minimum we will require for quality. As we tighten the Okay, thanks, Andrea, for coming to my rescue. But yes, CORSIA is not only generating demand, but it's also being very influential in setting standards of quality. Now, we are getting a lot of questions. I don't think we will be able to respond even a fraction of them, but the panelists will be here for a bit longer, or we will ask them to be here for a bit longer. So during the coffee break, you are free to go and ask. These are not easy questions, I want to tell you. For example, we got one for UNEP saying, how can we ensure that our work in carbon markets integrity also means dismantling red tape, complications, ensuring that resources flow directly. I'm not sure I have the the answer to that. So in that case, let me ask you a variation of that question to you, Christina. And the question is, how do you see the coalition working, and how do you see the contribution of the coalition in terms of diminishing this cost, this red tape, these challenges, when we want to scale carbon markets? I would like you to expand in terms of what it actually means.
Well, you didn't think that the QR code would work, right? So you have now many questions. Yeah, for sure, you can talk to me during the coffee break and to the others, and this discussion is very, very nice. And I think that the coalition has to work on interoperability and to go further on standardization, as Andrea was saying, as much as it can, because when we talk about this word, standard or harmonization, many countries and governments don't want to use them because it can mean that we are establishing a sort of view or methodology that is not appropriate to a local reality. And this is always the tension on this kind of discussions. You know this pretty well. And we see this tension here as well when we talk about integrity. What does integrity mean? So how we make this opportunity for developing countries that can capture, remove, reduce carbon emissions from so many different programs and projects and methodologies. And we have this intention to be selling carbon credits and make it a profitable business, not only a tool to mitigate emissions. And so the coalition can really help on building this interoperability and making clear politically, mainly politically, what are the dearest priorities for each country regarding those kind of standards. I think this is already something very important to make them clear, to really talk about this and explicit, right? And that's why when I talk about carbon markets, I say this is an industrial policy. It's not only about the environmental and climate policy. This is a trade and investment policy as well. And if we look into the European compliance carbon market, we can see how important it has been to incentivize some key industries in Europe and bring more competitiveness to these industries, to build up technology and intellectual property rights. We are talking about technology always, and we are talking about financing those technologies, which is always a challenge, to don't say a problem for us in the developing countries. How can we finance this? Because there are so many opportunities. So, for instance, the Brazilian biome called Caatinga has a huge potential capturing carbon, 14 times higher than the Amazon itself. How are we going to make this opportunity really a benefit for the local communities that are living there? So these are the sort of difficulties that we have to talk about. But we are looking to the voluntary carbon markets and how do they communicate to the compliance carbon markets, what's the offset rules, right? And then what are the international transfers that will be allowed? That's why I agree the regulation makes the whole difference. So speaking about the Brazilian case, now that we are in the first year of the implementation of the Brazilian ETS, we have to decide the scope, the sectorial scope, the gas scope. How are we going to look into activities, source, or installations? So when you establish this unit measure, then it can completely change the game. You go to one way or to another way. And this is very, very important and complex. It must be scientific and technical based. And also it has to be interoperable with other markets if we want to avoid fragmentation. So this first step of every carbon pricing system of defining the scope, it's already huge step that can make really difference in terms of economic opportunities and environmental benefits of the regulation. And then we go further, we go to the MRV studies, we go accrediting methodologies, which are the methodologies, and because we need methodologies that are acceptable by the demand side, but that are also opportunities for the supply side and for bringing new environmental benefits that are not considered in traditional methodologies, let's say. So we can make this world more complex, and we need to do so. And we need, for instance, Inger was mentioning this, talk about nature-based solutions in a broader way, right? We need to really put the finger in this wood, like we say in Brazil, and trying to find new pathways. I'm also optimistic about the carbon markets. There are more markets now, let's say, for this new technological routes, including biofuels, including aviation fuel, which is very interesting and very important for us and the developing countries that are producing biofuels for decades now. Brazil is producing ethanol since the 80s, and it was not valued. And then when we talk about cascading effects of the use of biomass, maybe we are compromising some technological routes such as the biofuels. So we have to really respect the national choices regarding how we're going to decarbonize our own economies. And I hope that the open coalitions helps to make it clear.
Thanks very much, Cristina. I have like 3-4 questions in the list, but I don't think we will have time. Please, Cristina will stay a bit longer. Alfonso, I also have some list of questions. I'm just striving to pick one. I was going to ask you a similar question like, Andrea, for the next few years, okay? What are the 1, 2, 3 factors that as the bank you would be paying attention to if the goal is to scale up carbon market activity in Africa? But one of the things that I wanted to ask you, if it is included in that list, is, check this one. A carbon market project to prove additionality, it may have to go through the test of financial additionality. I mean, basically meaning that unless you have the credits, you cannot do the activity. So is that a vicious cycle for the bank? I mean, I go to you and I say, Alfonso, I need the money, but actually my business is not financially viable. Is that a factor or is not in the list of things that you're paying attention to?
Very, very good point. And whoever asked that question, please look for me. And whoever is interested in the answers, we can take this for. The conversation around financial additionality is very, very hard, very complex, and I'm hoping that as the negotiations continue to evolve, we can then narrow down on how to look at the element of additionality that talks to finance different. But look, let me put it in this context, and I think just summarizing what many of us have been saying here. I think we can all agree in this room right now that this thing we call carbon market is not perfect, and perhaps for the next foreseeable future, it would never be perfect. But I think what Inga said, for me, was the key, perhaps the best thing she said was, look, it is complex, it is technical, but it matters. And we can choose to focus our attention on the aspect, the positive aspect where it matters. And some other people can choose to talk about how complex it is and how impossible it is. So what I always argue in my individual capacity is we can take the risk of flying the plane as we're building it. We may not ever have the luxury to fully build the plane, test it, and see if it's ready, but before we then start, because there's a sense of urgency involved in the global mitigation agenda. So we may need to start, and do some things. And we're already doing that in a way. So our approach is understand what are the entry points in reducing the complexity. And some of the conversations about harmonization of standards and on, expanding the market options for a developer, those are some of the ways, in my opinion, on reducing the complexity. But the other part of it is also the notion that what we call high integrity is like a burden on the supplier of the credit. And the demand person on the other side is not willing to pay something, a price that's commensurate to the integrity. We can't be asking for high integrity carbon credit when we're thinking of $3 to $4 per ton. I don't think it makes sense at all. So, and that's where the conversation around pricing and integrity becomes very critical for us. I'm hoping that we can expand our thinking around that, and hopefully the second panel will look more into that. The third part is also to continuously look at, in the future, and the question you asked, how can we make carbon become an asset and perhaps a financial instrument? If we can do that, then today, MDBs, DFIs, commercial banks can provide capital to carbon projects. If we see it as an asset that has a value, can be priced, can be monetized, and generally acceptable in the market system, and we also see it as a financial instrument. In the absence of that, we're going to continue to do what we're doing, which is basically creating a dedicated facility or looking at a blended finance structure outside the formal or structured balance sheet of big banks to be able to do that. So I think it's a lot of work for a lot of our negotiators to look into what practical reality in implementation will be. Even for us, the best we can do at the moment is create a sub-window and try to de-risk investment because carbon market is a performance market. And you may need to have upfront investment needed at the beginning before you pay for the reward that is verified and authenticated. So some of those resources needed, you need somebody who can take the risk. And that's why MDBs like us can step in and take the risk to be able to de-risk those kind of investment. But at the end of the day, I think we must see it as a huge opportunity for us. Hoping that all of the layers of complexity will be addressed as we move forward. But in Africa, we must see it. I'll leave you with one thing. I mentioned the fact that we're operating within only 2% of our potential. If we increase that potential to 15%, we could unlock $31 billion annually from carbon revenue. We're just talking of the potential of a continent to be part of it. You increase it from 2%, as currently as it is, to about 15% of its potential. We're not even being ambitious. We're not going to 100% of our potential, or 50%, just 15%. We could be unlocking $31 billion of carbon revenue into the continent. And that could push the margin forward in terms of our low carbon development in Africa. Thank you.
Thanks, Alfonso. You made me remember that, saying you got $1 billion here, another $1 billion over there, and all of a sudden you start to talk about real money, yeah? I think that you have also responded a question that we got, which was something like, should we be encouraging carbon market or just let the private sector to go for it and just. And I like to close the panel by saying that, well, markets do not work in an empty space. They do not work in a vacuum. They need rules of the game, something that several of you were saying, and that's actually the role of governments. So you just, unless governments play their role, and it's a critical one, it's a necessary condition, I don't believe there is a way for the private sector just to do it by itself. So, Christina, yes.
I just wanted to say something before we finish, because Alfonso provoked this. And when we look to financial assets, to carbon credit as financial assets, we really need to discuss also the legal nature of those carbon credits. So in some countries, they are commodities. In some countries, like Brazil, they are securities. In some other countries, they are property assets. And this makes the difference when we go through the financialization of the carbon credits. So we are developing rating agencies and so forth. And if we want this to scale, even especially for the private sector to step in, we need the stock exchanges. We need to make them more fluid, like liquid. And that's why the importance of how we see this as an asset, and we start to make this easier to flow from one country to another, is another thing that we can improve.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks so much, Christina, and that's another role of governments to do. So with that, I would like to give the panel a big round of applause. As I said, they will be here for a few more minutes. You can find them and ask all the questions you had. So how we will continue? We will have now a 5 minutes coffee break. Go grab a coffee. We don't want to kill you with 3 hours of continuous carbon market discussion. Not even myself, I can take that. So there is a coffee break at the back. We will continue in 5 minutes, and we will have a presentation by Allied Offsets. Allied Offsets is a carbon intelligence outlet, and it will continue talking a bit of what we were asking Alfonso, which is financing in carbon markets. From there, we will give the podium to Karen to go into Article 6, and then we will go into the panel. So with that, we go into a 5 minutes break. Panel, thank you so much. of presentations. What we will follow now will be this overview of the status of Article 6, 6.2, 6.4. That will be given by our colleague Karen Olsen. Karen, please, we invite you to take the stand. Karen Olsen is the co-chair of the Carbon Market Group at UNEP. She has a very, very long time working on carbon markets, from the CDM to Article 6. Sustainable Development Tool is probably one of the most knowledgeable person you will find when it comes to Article 6 and the status of it. So with that, Karen, the floor is yours.
Hello, colleagues. Pleasure to be here, and I will give a presentation on the Article 6 pipeline, which, as Gabriel said, is a continuation of the CDM pipeline as we move from the Kyoto Protocol era of carbon markets to the Paris Agreement carbon markets. We are transitioning CDM projects to Article 6. And I hope that my presentation will be available just now. I click. Okay, that was too much. Right, okay. So we're jumping into what the Article 6 pipeline is. The background and history. It builds on this more than 20 years experience of tracking the projects in the CDM. We started this in 2002, and at that time, the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center was called the Risø Center. So we have more than 30 years of existence. But in 2024, we then were merged into the Climate Change Division of UNEP. And that's also when, after we had the Glasgow Rulebook on Article 6, it really took off with the beginning of the new carbon market, the international one defined under the Paris Agreement. So the aim is we're tracking the tools of how the parties have defined the international carbon market, and we also track the data with monthly updates. And what I will present now is a demo of what the pipeline looks like. It's still in the making. It's been in the making for 2 years. And it will become a much more interactive, user-friendly platform where users can download own data. So we're transforming this Excel-based database into a web-based platform. And the overall goal of this is the same as what Article 6 says in the Paris Agreement, that carbon markets are meant to promote ambition, ensure environmental integrity, and sustainable development. So it's the 1.5 degree target, it's accounting, transparency, and it's the sustainable development impacts and no harm. So, and that's how we do it in the pipeline, providing transparency, conducting analysis, and making this data available open source. We have the data from the UNFCCC Secretariat as it becomes available, and then it is enriched by our own research and analysis. And we're also taking in data from other initiatives like Climate Watch and the Net Zero Tracker, so we can track how initiatives, activities at the sort of the national, local level connect to the national and global goals. So what I have today is just the global data and the country level data. The other components of the pipeline, the activities, the cooperation, the 6.2, the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, and the analysis hub. It's in the making. It takes a long time to do the design and then the coding behind the programming of how to visualize and analyze the data. So this we're planning for a full launch in early next year. But the global data, it provides overviews by countries, by regions, and by socioeconomic groups, LDC sits. And we are linking the activity data to the national targets and priorities. And these are the views, the data points, which is tracking agreements between countries, the bilateral agreements, also known as cooperative approaches, of which the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism is one approach. It's named one in how the data is tracked. You also have the VCM crediting programs, can be cooperative approaches, and then you can have single activities. So it's 3 kinds. And then you have 6.4, which is what we know, the crediting mechanisms. And a new feature of this is that there is now a mandatory sustainable development tool. In the Kyoto Protocol, this was voluntary, but now it's mandatory. And that means that we can also track the contribution to sustainable development. The mitigation outcomes are sold, ITMOs, or the emission reduction units in 6.4. They're priced in the carbon markets, but the sustainable development benefits stay in the host country. They may be priced, they're not yet priced. The price may be internalized into the ton of a credit. But so far, it's assessing what it is. So you can filter, and you will get country-level details. And we are also, well, I'll come to that in the next pages, but this is the structure and content of the global data. And this is what it will look like. The map, you can search for countries, and as of now, we have, out of the 198 countries worldwide, we have 62 with bilateral agreements. Only 4 with the transferred ISMOs, and 16 with approved PACM activity. So it's very early days of the market. It's growing and in the making. As for the activities, we're tracking projects and programs across what sectors, what types of activities, and here we have, at the higher level, we have 30+ activities, the sectors where they are implemented, and then we have 150+ subtypes. And that's where we build on the past data from CDM. We build on what the Secretariat has in their databases. And we also, based on our own research, we define, based on these, and you've heard that in the former panel, that the common nomenclatures, having interoperability between different sources of data. So we take that into account, IPCC level, which is more the sectoral level. Also from the open source Berkeley voluntary registry offsets database collecting from across the standards. And this is what it looks like on the page. So these are the activities. How many tons of CO2 will they reduce per year? In what categories? The activity types, and then you can filter by the gas. Is it reductions, removals, which year, and so on. The cooperation, the markets, we also have non-markets, but we just track the markets. So for 6.2, the bilateral collaboration. And right now it's some ITMO issues, but it's mainly bilateral agreements. And then we do deep dives for both of these types of cooperation, tracking also transactions throughout the activity cycles. And this is an example of what the activity cycle looks like. This is for illustrative purposes. We don't have the data yet, but we're sort of loading the data into the structure that we have created. And this shows how the CDM those projects that have requested transition, how do they sort of travel through the activity cycle? What are the requests? Well, first, what are the eligible CDM projects? What are the requests? And have they been approved? And in Billem, we just had a decision that the deadline has been extended for approvals. It was by the end of December this year, but it's now been extended till June 26. There were not that many approvals. And for the new activities, they're known as the prior consideration notifications for PACM. Those that are proposed, published, approved, registered, and last issued. So we will track as they move through the activity cycle. The analysis hub, this allows deep dives and explainers. It will give users the option to ask questions for the data available, and to, if it's a country assessment, I want to know how many CDM projects in Pakistan, how many PACM activities, and so on. You can find the data, and you will also be able to download it and have illustrations by the views that I explained earlier. So one example question is, how many landfill gas projects are planned in South America? And what is their expected GHG impact? Where do I find the documents? You will be able to access that information here. And this is an example of what it looks like for bilateral agreements across regions. You see the most from Asia, both in terms of the host and the buyer countries. And a lot of this comes from the Japan joint crediting mechanism, which started very early. So they have a lot of activities, bilateral activities. But also a lot from Africa and Europe being a source of demand. And with the EU 2040 target, with use of up to 5%, starting 2036, we can expect more demand from Europe. And for sustainable development, which is one of the deep dives in the analysis hub, the 6.4 tool states that it is mandatory for project participants to use the tool. And they have to assess what is the contribution from activities to the sustainable development priorities of the host country. So not all host countries have yet made it available. In fact, we have only 38 submissions from host parties stating what their sustainable development priorities are. And this is a little free format. So the analysis we do at UNEP CCC is we read the submissions, and then where it's stated what are the SDG priorities. And here you see the top one is a contribution to SDG 7, affordable and clean energy, climate action including adaptation, and so on. And that means that the project participants will then report against these priorities. What are the contributions? And it's also in the tool that there will be development of indicators so that it can be quantified. It's still very early days, indicators are not yet quantified, but this will give us the database to promote standardization. And there's also risk assessments, which looks like this. There are 11 elements of the risk assessment against environmental and social risks. So again, it's the project participants that assess, and here we have just 4 projects where we have data from new PACM activities that have used the tool. And one example of a risk is that there was one project that identified the risk of corruption. So when you've identified a risk, you also need to make a plan for how to mitigate it. And it will be monitored throughout the activity cycle. It's also, compared to earlier, it's a very comprehensive approach. So it's not only the PPs, the developers that get access to the information, it's also local stakeholders that can comment on whether did they capture them all. So it's a much more robust process now than it was in the past. And it's not only in compliance markets, it's also in the voluntary market that we see that sustainable development, positive impacts, minimizing risks, involving local communities, indigenous people, it's at the core of what defines integrity. It used to be very peripheral, and now it's at the core. So I think in many ways we're moving the right direction towards improvements. And this data here will also help with learning and giving public access to information. We'll have full transparency. And here, I have a link to the platform. Let me see if I can actually access that link. Click it. I wanted to give you a live demo of what it looks like. But I'm not sure how I click the link. From this one, can I have some help in clicking the link? Okay, if this is not working, then you will miss the live demo of the platform. So that this will give you, when it becomes available, you can see how it is interactive, how you scroll through the data. Oh, okay, yeah, so if you click the link, not quite there. Anyways, it will come. So it was meant to be today. We would have the first public version of the live platform, where users can go and explore all the data yourselves. But that's not working today. Sorry about that. And there are a few more slides that I cannot access with my remote here. If I can have some help in getting to the next slide. Okay, so while that may not come, the last few slides, there it is. So this was to say that the pipeline is one of the sort of support initiatives or support programs we have for Article 6 implementation. In addition to this, which will have a capacity building component where you can find, for instance, the 6 guides that we have produced in the supporting preparedness for Article 6 cooperation, which is funded by the IKI German initiative and implemented a consortium with 5 partners led by Global Green Growth Institute and with 3 private sector partners. We're supporting Pakistan, Zambia, Colombia, Thailand. And this is exactly with the country readiness that we heard before. It's the policy frameworks, it's the legal frameworks, it's the operational rules and guidance that are much needed to get the Article 6 implemented. We didn't have that before in CDM. This is a must-have now, and it is in the making, supported by Spark, and it is also supported by our integrated assessment for Article 6 project, which is supported by DG Klima from the European Union. And here the integrated assessment is that it's not just about transaction. Countries, as we also heard from Brazil, they need to do their homework in terms of what they sell and what they keep to avoid overselling, risking compliance with own NDC targets. So integrated assessment is about knowing your transparency data, how you report in initial reports, agreed electronic formats, biannual transparency reports, so that when you do the corresponding adjustment, if you sell the ITMO, that means you will add it to your inventory. And that's what this project helps countries do their homework, so to say, before making decisions about Article 6 transactions. And last, we have this on the Sustainable Development Initiative that we are promoting best practice across compliance voluntary markets. And last, this is how you access the database. And right now, it's still Excel, but watch it, and you will soon have the live demo or the live platform. So with that, thanks, and for the opportunity to present today. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Karen, for your presentation. At the end of this presentation, you're going to find our email addresses to share these slides, and you are going to be able to explore deeper the different links and features that Karen was talking about. My name is Micaele Pasetti, Carbon Market Specialist at UNEP, and I'm going to walk you through our panel on finance. As you may already know, finance is of paramount importance. When it comes to carbon markets, it is needed to develop projects, but once projects are developed, finance is what turns carbon credits into long-term revenues. Revenue that it is able to mobilize finance to impact positively in communities and to drive sustainable development. So I'd like to invite you to engage in our panel. The scene-setting presentation is going to be delivered by Allied Offsets, a carbon data provider based in London. Fundile Mafanga, their policy lead, is the one who is going to be presenting. So I invite you to watch the video and to engage in our upcoming panel. Thank you.
Hello, good day. My name is Fundile Mapanga. I am the policy lead at Allied Offsets, and today I'll be covering the state of the voluntary carbon market, integrity, capital, and future opportunities. Allied Offsets has been graciously invited. We thank the organizers and the UN Environment Programme in particular for inviting us to present today and to cover set the stage for a very important conversation. We are a data aggregator. We cover the supply, demand, price, and policy insights of the voluntary carbon market, as well as the emerging carbon dioxide removals market. And our data covers over 36,000 projects, 37 registries, 21,000 corporate buyers, as well as the broad supply and demand dynamics. The agenda for this brief intervention will look at market momentum, transactions, prices, and capital flows, quality differentiation and how buyer preferences are shifting, the rise of offtake agreements, and then also market outlook and forecasting opportunities. The voluntary carbon market is oversupplied. We have seen 5.6 billion credits issued by voluntary carbon credit project activities and only 1.5 billion retirements. The growing share, cumulative remaining credits or unretired credits, has been constraining prices in the voluntary carbon market and been largely driven by concerns around reputational risk for corporate offsetting due to the environmental integrity of carbon credits, as well as looking at the governance practices and records of project activities with regards to benefit sharing that have warded off buyers. We have also started to see, even up to date, the 1.5 billion retirements still account for only 0.06% of historic greenhouse gas emissions, which still make the voluntary carbon market a rounding error. However, there's still a lot of space for the voluntary carbon market to grow, both in terms of scale and also in terms of deepening its commitment towards rebuilding itself as a higher integrity market. We have started to see the prices, which have been historically depressed in the last 3 years, from these concerns start to uplift through our Allied Offsets 500 index. The Allied Offsets 500 covers the 500 most active project activities in our database, and we've seen that the prices have started to rebound. But however, for the legacy project activities, we have started to see those prices continue to slump and further and further. So cook stove projects have recorded a negative 45.7% decrease since 2022, and Red Plus a negative 65.7% decrease. And then cook stove and Red from its peak have dropped by 60 and 66%. Buyer preferences are shifting. We are seeing a larger share of market value shift away from avoidance and reduction project activities towards technical and nature-based removals. This indicates buyers are prioritizing credibility and long-term climate impact over lower cost. We are also starting to see, in terms of standardized quality indexes, that the shift is moving away from lower integrity to higher integrity. We look at projects that have been rated by independent rating agencies such as B0, Calix Global, Silvera, as well as looking at projects that have been approved by the ICVCM CCP rating at the methodology level, and we're able to determine that the share of retirements are for higher integrity project activities is increasing over about 60% and higher, and then as well as the share of medium project activities between 40 and 60% of that normalized quality score are increasing, whereas the share of the lower value projects, as in terms of the quality indicators, is decreasing. And that we've also been tracking the depth between the voluntary carbon market and compliance markets, which allow for their use. For voluntary carbon markets, which have allowed to be used towards compliance schemes, we have seen that they're still 35% cheaper than the average ETS and carbon tax in which they are accepted. And then for CORSIA, the global sectoral compliance scheme for aviation, we've seen CORSIA credits are on average 20 times cheaper than sustainable aviation fuel credits and 5 times cheaper than the EU ETS allowance unit. For Article 6, we've seen Article 6.2 and 6.4 have prices that are significantly lower than decarbonization costs. So the average Article 6.2 bilateral agreement price at around $30 per ton differs very greatly from the average Article 6.4 transaction project price at $3 per ton, which is expected to rise as the pipeline for the projects becomes clearer and for the transactions to start to become recorded on the interim registry and then finally on the Paris Agreement Crediting Mechanism registry. The offtake agreements have started to shape this new age of the market. Buyers are looking to deliver commitments to activities for the forward purchase of project for credits, and that sends a financing signal to project activities, which can then deliver project activities and emission reductions or removals with a future delivery in mind. We have seen a recorded 14-year horizon of the average time horizon for an offtake agreement, and we've started to see offtake agreements start to pick up both in volume and also in terms of number over time. We have seen the percentage of offtake agreements in 2025 compared to the spot retirement figures reach 44.8%, and they have seen a 320 times increase in the last 5 years. And we have also started to see the Vera and ART methodologies top the volume of credits under offtake agreements as seen in this chart here as well. We are continuing to see this being split amongst mainly nature-based and removal methodologies. However, we are also starting to see off-registry methodologies as well being recorded. In terms of outlook, the market is currently sitting at around a $1.3 billion value, and we project the market to be able to scale to $161 billion by 2050 under a medium growth scenario. What we assume is price-adjusted demand. It will be addressed as oversupply is addressed. So as the oversupply of credits are times, we will see clearing prices for voluntary carbon market projects such as CORSIA. But however, with the oversupply in credits, we still see constrained market prices. As the oversupply declines due to the discounting of project types, such as seen through ICVCM's core carbon principle approval process, we will start to see clearing prices rise. And as demand stabilizes, we shall start to see more project activities and also more revenue opportunities begin to become clearer and clearer as we progress from 2030 onwards. And through forecasting revenue projections, we are able to project the market value of the voluntary carbon market across different geographies. We've seen the greatest market revenue projections across the Asia and Asia Pacific. We've also seen nature-based revenue projections across EMEA, and we've also seen that the same in terms of nature-based and engineered projections across Latin America and North America as well. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at fundile.mapanga@alliedoffsets.com, and I wish you all the best in a very fruitful and engaging discussion.
Fundile has laid the groundwork for our panel, so now I'd like to invite the panelists to come to the stage. Roslyn Ate is a senior advisor consultant with Environmental Defense Fund. She has almost 2 decades of experience in REDD+, forest governance, climate policy, and carbon markets. Omon Ukpoma Olaija is the regional investment team lead for East and Southern Africa and the Arab state regions at the United Nations Capital Development Fund. She works with partners to unlock private and public capital in high-risk markets. Andrew Wiener is the head of business development for environmental markets at MSearch, a climate tech platform that enables carbon credit trading through a digital market infrastructure. Andrew focuses on driving early-stage liquidity, structuring long-term offtake agreements, and advancing project finance solutions. Last but not least, Luke Seeley is a senior consultant at EY's Global Center for Climate Policy, which is an international expert hub that works with governments, helping them to design climate policies, with corporates in need of understanding how these shifting policies will impact their business, and with developers looking to build high-quality offsetting projects. It is an honor to me to share the stage with these outstanding professionals in the field. Welcome, and thank you. Now it's working. Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to start this panel talking about UNCDF. UNCDF has a unique mandate to use catalytic finance to fill investment gaps in those markets in which private sector is not that interested because they are high risk or too small. So taking into account this unique mandate of UNCDF, I'd like to ask you, Mon, what is UNCDF's strategic vision when it comes to carbon markets?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Omon. So maybe just to set the scene, UN Capital Development Fund was established in over 60 years ago, in 1966. And we were given a very unique capital mandate by the General Assembly, which is really to supplement existing resources with our instruments, which is investment grants, concessional loans, and guarantees. And UN Capital Development Fund has been set up as a risk absorber. So what that means is that our mandate is really focused on supporting least developed countries, small island development states, fragile countries, these countries that ordinarily find it very difficult to access finance from traditional financial institutions like the MDBs, DFIs, etc. At the Financing for Development conference in Seville, UN Capital Development Fund was actually recognized as a risk absorber in this outcome document. So it really just emphasized the role that UN Capital Development Fund plays in this space, basically because we're able to take significant amounts of risk, and our balance sheet is able to absorb a significant amount of risk within the carbon markets. So first and foremost, the countries that we serve, that is priority, which is LDCs, SIDS, and fragile countries. These are countries that is actually home to close to 1 billion people. And one of the overreaching objectives for UN Capital Development Fund is to really ensure that these countries that suffer from significant level of risk, most of which is perceived risk, are able to access and benefit from high integrity carbon markets. Now, the way we do that in terms of our vision is really first and foremost to leverage on the fact that UN Capital Development Fund as a fully as an institution that is fully capitalized by grants, we're able to use this grants capital as a form of financial de-risking to minimize the risk that exists in these investments within the carbon market. So the deployment of our instruments, our financial de-risking instruments, because our grants capital can take significant amounts of risk, is also very critical. I think the other thing I would also mention is, at UN Capital Development Fund, our vision, in addition to what I mentioned earlier, is the urgency to ensure that we're able to build partnerships. And in the work that we do, we work with partner UN agencies, but we also work with the private sector development institutions to deploy our instruments to ensure that we can minimize the risk and ensure that these countries, the LDC, SIDS, and fragile countries that are often excluded from the carbon markets because of the high level of perceived risk or the low level of maturity of these markets, are able to also benefit from carbon markets. So that's, in summary, the overreaching objective of UN Capital Development Fund in the carbon markets. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omon. As you have mentioned, the catalytic finance has the purpose of minimizing risks, and another purpose is to crowd in private sector investment. So I'd like to ask Luke, according to your experience, what are the most important things investors from the private sector focus on when committing capital?
Hello. Okay, sorry about that. No, thank you for that question. I think that's super important because sometimes when the private sector is not included upfront in the discussions, and ultimately the policies and regulations end up affecting the private sector. So speaking from a private sector lens, I can tell you that investors are not just looking at headlines. They're looking for substance. And this comes up in conversation all the time, and I would like to echo what Andrea from AITA had mentioned, was that the uncertainty that currently exists, corporates are not currently focusing on, let alone looking in the direction, if there's such high risk. Whose pension fund invests in carbon credit projects? Yeah, so because of the high risk that it carries, the corporate and private sector is really hesitant at the moment. And when it comes to focusing on it, the word bankability gets thrown around quite a lot, but I would also like to take it a step further to focus on bankability with investability. So in the carbon market context, to make something bankable, it means the project is structured in a way that financial institutions and investors see it as low enough risk and commercially viable, which is super critical to get these things moving. So it's about the clear cash flows, clear governance, and the robust monitoring systems that reduce the uncertainty. The investability aspect attached to the bankability goes a step further, and it talks about the attractiveness of these projects. And to get private capital based on the expected returns, the policy stability, and the market demand. So maybe just to sum that up, the bankability is about making projects safe for financing, and the investability is about making it appealing enough for investors to commit capital confidently. And it's not just new investors, it's traditional investors focused on other traditional safe investments globally to then be able to participate in the carbon market. And then to unlock that private capital at scale, it needs the robust, transparent, and trustworthy, and it needs to be similar to a leading world stock exchange. And if you think about it, investors to put their money into stocks, because exchanges like the New York Stock Exchange or whichever your exchange is in your country are highly regulated, and they have a clear set of rules, and they offer strong protections. So if a carbon market can offer the same level of security, transparency, and liquidity through strong standards, reliable data, and effective oversight, then investors will start to see carbon credits not just as a niche environmental tool, but as a mainstream financial asset. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luke, for shedding light on bankability and investability. I'd like to focus a bit on demand. You mentioned that Andrea, our panelist from the previous session, she also mentioned carbon market is a demand-driven market. And when it comes to demand, there are some interesting things happening. As Aled Offset stated, offtake agreements are starting to peak in volume and in numbers. So Roslyn, I'd love to have your perspective when it comes to demand, and what are the perceived demand signals from both supply side and demand side in carbon markets currently?
Thank you very much, Michaela. A very good morning to everybody in the room, and many thanks for having EDF here to contribute to this amazing panel. Yesterday I was here to look at the venue for the event, and when I saw these chairs, I said, this is the very first time I'm seeing such chairs at a conference, very comfortable. And I was hoping that they'll be here today, and they are here today, so I'm very happy to be here. So the question about demand signals, and I want to unpack this into who is looking at what from Global South and Global North. And the work that EDF does, we really support countries, particularly from the Global South, to be able to get to the stage of supplying. The team that I work with is the forest team, and we do a lot more on forest, nature-based solutions. So if I'm biased towards that side, you know why. Now, when you talk about demand signals, and Luke has mentioned some of the things, the Global North is looking at, well, when there's a pledge, there's a commitment, it signals demand. You have these huge announcements when we have conferences. And the Global South, again, is looking at high integrity. They're looking at how indigenous people and local communities are going to be respected, how direct access can be created for them to receive the benefits of any carbon market transaction as the stewards of these lands. They are looking at how robust MRV structures are, how safeguards compliance is, and of course, the question about risk comes in. Now, when you get into the Global South, and I want to begin with what Omon said. For the Global South, there's a lot more about trying to overcome so many barriers to actually actualize this demand. Now, when there is a pledge or a commitment, it doesn't automatically end up in the supply side. There are a number of things that happen. You can hear about a pledge in 5 years, and it still hasn't materialized in the Global South country. So delivery is very important to Global South countries as a demand signal. What are the delivery channels? How long is it going to take to receive these funds or commitments that have been made? The second one is also the bureaucracy. Okay, what different channels must we go through? There are times when countries think that, oh, we are at the end of the spectrum, and then a new requirement is introduced. Sometimes from the buyer, from the standard setter, from whoever is doing the validation and verification process. And so a number of things really do happen before those demand signals begin to actualize. Again, for the Global South, it's also about interoperability, and I've heard about that word since I walked in here this morning. A number of countries are using different standards. How interoperable are those standards to buyers? Is it possible to just migrate from one standard to the other and still have the same appeal for the demand side? The question will be high integrity, but when you consider all different standards that are out there. Most of them are working based on the same principles. Probably they are nuanced in different directions, but then the principles are the same. They are respecting safeguards, they are talking about MRV, they are talking about grievance redress mechanisms, respect for indigenous people and local communities. And so there have to be pathways where there can be easy migration from one standard to the other. And I want to use an example. A number of countries started the Red Plus process with the FCPF. Now the FCPF is closing, or has even closed. The countries that are in there are the only ones in there now. No other countries are being accepted into the carbon fund of the FCPF. We have ART now. Vera GNR is there. How easy will it be for the countries that did readiness with the FCPF, that are in the carbon fund of the FCPF, to now transition to use trees or to use Vera GNR? These are very huge questions that also tell on the demand signals. And then finally, or not finally, the nature of the transaction agreements. Now, there can be an announcement really in the space that probably a buyer is getting these number of credits from country X or country B. Question is, what kind of agreement? What will be the negotiation process? What are the risk instruments in there? What are the immunity instruments in there? The indemnity instruments in those agreements? Do the supply side, or does the supply side even always have the sort of architecture that the demand side wants? For example, we have agreements that take conflict resolution outside the jurisdiction of the supplier into a different state. And so if there is a conflict, it means the whole supply side must begin to learn about how conflict resolution is done in a different context. This, again, is critical for the Global South when we talk about demand signals. And lastly, I want to talk about trust. And Omon said something which struck me, the fact that some of these risks are really perceived. They're actually not even the risks that are actualized, they are perceived risks. But based on perceived risks, a lot of bottlenecks and requirements are put in the place of getting really to these commitments when they are made. So there can be demand signals, that there can be offtake agreements, there can be nice announcements when we attend COPs or we are in conferences, but the road to getting those funds into countries, into spaces, really is a long road, and it takes a lot of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roslyn. I like to stop in integrity, because you mentioned that integrity is a key driver of both supply and demand willingness to operate in the market. And over the last 2 years, the share of credits retired from high-quality projects has increased. So I'd like to explore with Andrew, what is the correlation between price and quality, especially when it comes to CCP eligible, CORSIA eligible, and Article 6 eligible credits?
Thank you, Michaela, for the question, and thank you to the UNEP and the fellow panelists for allowing me to be here today. I think that CCPs, CORSIA, and Article 6.2 are three very distinct conversations with overlapping themes. So if we take CORSIA, for example, what we see is it's a compliance market where buyers are looking for the lowest cost compliance credits. So what that means is that for, let's say, the ICE exchange, for instance, for delivery of CORSIA-eligible tokens in the generic form by the end of 2026, the price is currently somewhere between $16.50 and $17. On the ABEX exchange, it's closer to $19, and on the spot market, it's around $22 to $23. If we take then the core carbon principles, what we see is the core carbon principles represent a binary qualitative assessment of methodologies. So when we're looking at both of these things, what's important is not is whether these standards and qualitative assessments represent rigorous enough methodologies that the projects that are executed both under their best and their worst forms constitute high quality credits. And as someone who's been a private sector actor for many years now, it has been very challenging and a true test of patience to wait for these methodologies, to wait for this clarity in these regulations to come out. But I do want to applaud the ICAO and I do want to applaud the ICVCM for creating what is now perceived to be very, very rigorous and high quality assessments on carbon credit criteria. So from a market perspective, I think the consensus is yes, CCP labeled credits and CORSIA credits are high quality, and the benefits and price that we've seen according to these labels is well merited. when it comes to Article 6.2, this is a distinct and unique conversation altogether. Article 6.2 provides, on one hand, the elimination of concerns surrounding double counting, which is a huge benefit. And from speaking with many buyers, there is quite a bit of demand for these credits. This is the direction that the market itself is moving in. This convergence of voluntary, of compliance, of this desire for regulation, as Luke mentioned. So the demand is there. The challenge right now that most of the private sector buyers are facing is, well, how do they interact and how do they engage with Article 6.2? As with most things in the carbon markets, what we've seen is that it is disaggregated and proliferated in many cases. So if every country, for instance, that's in the Paris Agreement wants to make their own carbon registry to hold their Article 6.2 regulations, well, most of the major buyers that are regulated entities, it takes them 6 to 12 months to onboard a new registry. So if we wait for every single regulated entity to be onboarded to every single registry for every single country in the Paris Agreement, it will take us 96 years. So what we need to do is to focus and prioritize the consolidation and the aggregation of the work that everyone is doing. So I encourage all governments here to work within their regional collaboration centers, to work within the institutions and the frameworks that are in place right now, and to try and interconnect within private sector registries as much as possible, because every time that there is a new registry, something that needs onboarding, something that's going to have to undergo significant due diligence and KYC concerns, it serves only to delay the growth of the carbon markets for everyone and not just your country. So it's an opportunity to avoid this problem of stepping over a dollar to pick up a dime. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for shedding light on the nuances of integrity, price correlation, and touching base on the need for standardization and interoperability. We're going to come back to that topic soon. When it comes to integrity and price, we can certainly state that high integrity can push prices upward, but oversupply push prices downward. So I'd like to ask Luke, according to your experience working with the demand side and the private sector, what do investors, buyers perceive the balance between the oversupply and the current level of demand in the market?
Thank you, and my mic's working now. That's a great follow-up question. The balance between the number of carbon credits issued and those actually retired is a key indicator for investors when assessing the health and the credibility of carbon markets. So if you look at the market health and confidence, when credits are retired, meaning they're used to offset real emissions, it shows genuine demand for market maturity. If many credits are issued but few are retired, it can signal oversupply, low demand, or questionable quality. And investors don't want to see that. They want to see credits that are not just being created, but are actually being used for real climate action. You know, it's like if you go to a concert and apparently it's sold out and you rock up and you're in the stadium and this place is empty. It starts to speak to the integrity of what's actually going on. And if we look at the price signals and the quality, when the retirements increase, especially for high credit, for high quality credits, prices tend to rise. And then this reflects the growing confidence and shift towards a more discerning buyers. So one of our analysis shows that as the market matures, we're seeing more credits retired from high integrity projects, which is a positive sign, and we're heading in the right direction. And then something else to consider is the local versus international demand. The credibility of credits and the use, and whether it's for local compliance, international compliance, international agreements, or voluntary offsetting, this also matters. Credits retired for compliance, for those under CORSIA, as an example, often command much higher prices with greater scrutiny attached to it. So I guess the answer would be yes, investors closely watch the balance between issuances and retirements. A healthy market has a strong, consistent retirements of these credits, which signal real climate impact and investor confidence. Thanks.
Thank you, Luke. And you mentioned market maturity. When it comes to market maturity, the domestic context of institutions and policy is of paramount importance. Actually, Gabriel, in our previous panel, mentioned that carbon markets don't operate in an empty space. So I'd like to know your opinion, Rosalind, when it comes to the public sector support. So the question is, how critical is public sector support for creating enabling environments to ensure viable and scalable carbon markets?
Thank you once again, Michaela. Before I get to answer that question, I just want everybody in the room to get really thinking on what high integrity is defined to be, and also demystify normally the thought that high integrity is a request really from the buyers, but not from the supply side. It's not the case, and I always say that if we are to have climate disasters, those who suffer the most are really the supply side. And so integrity is very important to us because we have everything at stake, and that's why in recent time, a lot of supply side countries talk about adaptation, a lot alongside mitigation, and we treat integrity very, very seriously. So on what the public can do really on enabling environments, again, I want to unpack this from two ends. First, I want to begin with what the public sector within the Global North can do, so what governments can do. And when we talk about Article 6.2, a number of governments are having cooperative arrangements or agreements with developing countries. Let me use Ghana as an example. And let me use Switzerland as an example. We have Article 6.2 and Article 6.2 arrangement where the Swiss government is supporting their private sector to buy credits from high integrity projects that are happening in Ghana. I believe that we need more of those, and that is really a government providing that enabling framework through that cooperative arrangement. And then let me talk about 6.4. Within 6.4, we can have a lot of the developed countries or the Global North giving price signals that are interesting. Now, in the presentation that before the panel, we saw different price categories. The question is why? Because there's particular notions around different standards or different markets. It shouldn't be. We need to get to the place where we have a good price or a commensurate price for the value of the credits being sold. And the previous panel before ours, Olufunso spoke about the fact that you can't expect high integrity when you are not paying for it. And I have given this analogy somewhere before. When you get into a hotel, you can't pay for a 3-star hotel and expect a 7-star treatment. Even within a 7-star hotel, there are different categories. Some hotels will give you an airport shuttle, some will give you some complimentary service, you can have access to probably a bar. There are different nuances in there. So if you want high integrity, you pay for it. I believe that the Global South public sector can really stimulate that conversation because a lot of corporates look up to the government entities. Let me give an example. The Leave Coalition is a functional coalition that is really charting the path in bringing together private sector and also public or sovereign states. Probably is the first of its kind that we have seen in the nature-based solution space or specifically within the REDD+ space. But it's phenomenal because the corporates in there look up to what the sovereign states in there are doing. If today those sovereign states say, we want to buy the credits at $30 a ton, believe you me, a lot of the corporates are going to get convinced because most of them are depending on the structure and the architecture that the sovereigns have to drive this. Again, also, this leads me really into the voluntary carbon market, not just on 6.4. We can have a lot of these coalitions springing up where the public sector really provides the enabling environment and charts the path for coalitions where we have corporate support. And for 6.4, I also want to speak about methodologies. Methodologies are going to come up. What these methodologies will look like will largely be influenced by both Global South and Global North. And recently at COP30 in Berlin, In all the pavilions, in every event that I attended, I had a strong push, okay, for different sectors to all be recognized in Article 6.4. But when you get into the negotiation rooms, the conversation is different. And so I believe that, again, the public architecture can support what we say everywhere. We shouldn't have a different voice in the pavilions and a different voice in the negotiation rooms. Then I just want to briefly touch on what the Global South can also do. Beginning with NDCs. We need to have NDCs that are friendly towards private sector investments. Most NDCs have, and the ones that I have reviewed, talk about the fact that we need support. And so there are a number of conditional targets in there. Those conditional targets must speak the language of private sector to attract the support. The second is that we need the regulatory frameworks. And I heard, again, this in the first panel on Article 6. Countries must be up and doing to determine what is Article 6 going to look like, who would authorize, when and how, and what sectors. We also need very, very good documentation on how indigenous people and local communities are going to be engaged, and move beyond the documentation to actually develop governance that is inclusive, that involves women, involves youth, involves everybody who must be part of that process. And eventually we must work on equitable benefit sharing. This is very important. Equitable benefit sharing. How do we define carbon rights? Who owns the rights? Are the people who own the rights really being the ones who are going to receive the benefits at the end of the day? And finally, I want to touch on developing domestic carbon market mechanisms. I believe that every supply side country should tilt towards this, because we have a number of industries in supply side countries who don't even know about the carbon market conversation. These are domestic market entities. And if we're able to create the right awareness and build the domestic infrastructure, we're going to have a lot more trading in countries even before we begin to look outside. Thank you.
Thank you, Roslyn. Building on top of your answer, I'd like to emphasize that one way that public sector support materializes is through blended finance. So, Omon, I'd like to know your opinion about blended finance. What is the role of this solution, and what are the main challenges when deploying blended finance?
No, no, thank you very much. So maybe first and foremost, you know, at UN Capital Development Fund, we see blended finance as a structured approach that enables and provides a gateway where carbon market participation, particularly in frontier markets, can leverage on such opportunities. So to start with, now at UN Capital Development Fund, like I mentioned earlier, we are an organization that is fully funded by grants. And that allows that the grants funding that we get from, you know, different types of donors, philanthropic organizations, foundations, etc., allows us to blend our grant capital with return-seeking capital or commercial investors. And the blend between our grant capital and return-seeking capital or commercial capital allows us to de-risk investments. So first and foremost, so that approach that we take in being able to de-risk investments through a blend of grants and return-seeking capital, we adopt that blended finance approach in the markets that we serve. Now, in terms of, you know, looking at some of the risks that is also related to the blended finance is, first and foremost, is there is a significant lack of financial de-risking instruments, right? Because, you know, you can create and curate a, large or, increased number of pipeline, but if you don't have, financial de-risking instruments that can minimize this risk, risks that these countries or these markets suffer, which are really high level of perceived risk, it becomes really difficult for you to be able to integrate carbon market or carbon finance in these markets. So that's the first thing in terms of risk. Another aspect of risk when it comes to blended finance or the challenges is around transaction size. When you look at the markets where UN Capital Development Funds we operate, which is LDCs, seeds, and fragile countries, the transaction sizes in these countries are often very small, and they come with significant high level of transaction cost. And because of that, they are not very attractive to the traditional financial institutions, etc. So UN Capital Development Fund's mandate is really to provide that de-risking, is to provide that environment that allows, capital to flow in markets that ordinarily capital would not flow. Then I think the last one I would mention in terms of the challenges is really around market creation and market development. So in LDCs and seeds and these fragile countries, carbon market is still sort of immature, right? So there's a need to invest in capital that is more of risk tolerant capital that is able to create markets and develop markets around carbon finance in these countries. Now, just to close, to give you a little bit of context, UN Capital Development Fund in Tanzania has a Cook Fund program, right? And in this Cook Fund program, what we did is to work with the government of Tanzania to support close to 100 companies with upfront capital. And the upfront capital is to help these companies really develop solutions that provide clean cooking to Tanzania. Now, what does this really mean in the context of carbon markets? Now, we've successfully been able to support close to 100 companies. These companies have demonstrated, proven solutions when it comes to clean cooking. These companies has also been able to, through these solutions, has been able to show significant reduction in carbon emission. Now, the next step is really looking at these companies and working closely with the government in terms of how do we monetize this carbon emission, because the upfront capital that UN Capital Development Fund is able to provide to these enterprises allows us to take the risk that other partners will not take, right? So that upfront capital provides SMEs, companies with the capital that they need to generate to be able to generate carbon credit through the reduction of carbon emission, and also monetize that carbon credits through carbon revenue. And ultimately, these carbon revenues can then begin to repay some of these facilities like reimbursable grants that we can provide or loans, etc. So in summary, we do leverage on the benefits and the approach that blended finance provides, but we also want to make sure that these markets that are often excluded from carbon markets have and are able to access the benefits that carbon markets and carbon finance can bring to really develop these countries and help countries achieve their development objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Mon. I'd like to emphasize what you said about the small markets, which sizes increase the cost in those markets. And one way of addressing this challenge is by lowering entry barriers to ensure liquidity and enhance scalability in these markets. So Andrew, I'd like to ask you about these entry barriers. What do you think that they are? What challenges they mean for the market, and what measures could be taken to lower entry barriers to the market?
Thank you, Michaela, for the question. And before I dive into that, I do want to echo a sentiment that was said by Rosalind earlier about the need for domestic marketplaces to start occurring across the global south. I think that this is imperative to the success, not just of the markets themselves in those countries, but also towards our achievement as a global people towards our climate goals. And I know that everyone here is wary of the impact that this may have on private businesses, and I would encourage everyone not to listen to the moans and the gripes that you're going to get from some of the market participants in other private sectors, particularly the energy sector. If we look, for instance, at the liquefied natural gas market before the Ukraine conflict, it was selling at about $30 per MBTU. Then once the conflict started, it jumped up to $350 per MBTU, and what happened to demand? It increased. So please do not concern yourself with the crocodile tears cried by $100 million per year making CEOs. Take autonomy and the authority to do what's right for your countries and what's right for your planet. Now, in terms of barriers to entry in the market, there's multiple different perspectives from which we can look at this. For project developers, the upfront cost of generating projects or even generating an asset under one of the major registries can be hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And this is where the important work of people like the UN Capital Development Fund, the Clean Cooking Alliance, and the concessional financing that they provide is imperative toward the success of these early stage projects. For buyers, the language of carbon is complex, it is nuanced, it is proliferated. There are dozens of different sectors, and I'm sure everyone in this room has heard more acronyms in this sector than anything else combined. It's challenging, it's complicated, it's not easy to understand. And this is where things like the core carbon principles, the rating agencies, and other IGOs supports and corresponding adjustments come into play to provide some guarantees and some assurances to early stage buyers who don't have their own carbon desks that are in fact high quality, high integrity credits. But I think the group that faces the most barriers to entry out of everyone, and this is most pertinent, in fact, to the people in this room, is governments across the global south. This is, as has been mentioned, a complex market, and this is something where it takes years and years of knowledge building and capacity building and understanding and technical expertise in order to engage meaningfully and effectively in many cases in this market. And when you have limited resources at hand, that can be an incredibly daunting challenge, especially when furthermore, you're expected to create robust regulations surrounding this. So I think we're all sympathetic to the challenges and the struggles of coming up with these solutions. And this is what a great deal of our work at MSurge has now become, is trying to overcome these challenges. So we work with about 350 different traders, investors, buyers, project developers, all in the wholesale market. So the energy companies, the investment banks, so on and so forth, to create a free aggregated platform where governments, project developers, IGOs can all come and get free access to the data that they need, to the connections that they need, to the network that they need, and to the input and the consultative services that they need in order to grow and expand their markets. So what this has looked like over the last few months has been creating domestic marketplaces, which should be launched hopefully soon for a handful of countries across sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. It's looked like creating regional marketplaces for a variety of different areas across sub-Saharan Africa, as well as creating the potential, hopefully, for the first interconnected marketplace that will directly link energy commodities with carbon credits. So it's a one-stop shop for everything. And all of this work can be done at little to no cost for the governments themselves, for the Global South. It's more or less a free service. And this is in large part because the financing is there, the capital is there. It's not in the Global South, it's from the large buyers who claim that they don't have the money to put into these things. Well, I can assure you that they do. So I would encourage everyone in this room to think hard about what steps that they need to do to become more engaged in terms of how can they become more interconnected to the rest of the market? How can we come together as a global community to listen to more than the handful of energy and extractive companies that operate in mass across Africa and across Southeast Asia and the Global South? But how can we incorporate in the climate consultants, the SMEs, the investment banks, and the variety of other stakeholders in this market to create a more uniform, unified, consolidated, and aggregated market? Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I want to thank the audience, how active has been. We have received over 70 questions for you, but in interest of time, we are going to do one round of questions. And I'd like to start with Luke. Luke, you have been asked about the top 3 main interests for private sectors to commit capital in the carbon markets. So now I'd like to ask you about what are the top 3 investment barriers you think that the carbon market is experiencing when it comes to committing capital?
Sure. It would just be the inverse, I guess, of what I had just spoken about. So when the reliability isn't there and there's a lot of uncertainty floating around, it's like all it takes is one bad apple in a bag of 100 good apples for someone to put the bag down at the grocery store and pick up another one. And so that's why it's really important that we head in a direction to make sure that it's in a compliant, everything is regulated correctly, We're following a set of standards that not only work domestically, but also comply internationally. And until we reach that point, we hold the position that the private sector investors will remain slightly hesitant until that materializes.
Look for shedding light on that. Roslyn, the question to you is, how do you see the voluntary carbon market evolving in relation to the compliance market, specifically Article 6 mechanism?
Thank you very much. So the voluntary carbon market, I believe, has really stood in the space, even with all the Article 6 negotiations going on. And for me, I see a lot of appeal from the private sector for the voluntary carbon market. And in every conversation about carbon markets, we talk about the fact that we need blended finance, and this blended finance has private sector being a key player in there. And so I believe that the voluntary carbon market is still going to evolve as it should. There's still going to be an interest in the space for private sector players. But again, we are going to have, depending on how the methodologies within Article 6 look like, particularly for 6.4, we can get to a space where we have a lot of healthy competition, because for many years we've spoken about the compliance markets, we have had expectations for them, we are hoping that they come into force and really play the role that we're expecting them to play. But if the compliance markets don't come in with skill, we're going to have a challenge. We need to have skill. At the moment, a number of, for example, let me begin even with 6.2, the cooperative agreements that have been signed, I don't really see the scale in there. The magnitude of emission reductions being targeted is not that high for me. That is one area that is going to be a challenge, and I believe it's going to still pave way for a lot of voluntary carbon market conversations to go on. Second will be about the kind of methodologies and for which sectors. We all have to agree that some sectors are ready more than some other sectors. And so if you're a country here that's defining your Article 6 framework, you really need to do a lot of prioritization on what kind of sectors you put within which particular mechanism, whether 6.2 or 6.4. Because not all sectors are going to have the same level of maturity per time. Some are going to evolve and become the space for learning for other sectors to also follow. And so if you're a country that really wants to make inroads into the market, whether voluntary or compliance, you also need to know the appeal for what sector, depending on what particular market pathway or stream you want to take. So I believe that the compliance market is not going to shift the voluntary carbon market or displace it. I believe that they are going to run concurrently, but what will be the differential will be the skill and the kind of methodologies that are accepted really in 6.4. Thank you.
Thank you, Roslyn. Andrew, you have talked about different solutions to lowering these barriers. And the next question for you from the audience is, what's your opinion regarding the insurance solutions in the market?
I think insurance plays an important role in the continued development of the market. As Luke has mentioned before, there's a lot of challenges in the investability and bankability of these projects. And the more that we can lean on traditional forms of de-risking investments, such as insurance, the more likely it is that the market will grow in an expeditious manner. So we see the work being done by MEGA, by Howdens, by CFC as being well received within the market and imperative towards its growth. So we highly encourage that many market participants look more thoroughly into the insurance companies and what is available, because we do feel like it's an important component of the market going forwards.
Thank you, Andrew. Omon, the question to you is regarding UNCDF. Is there exist a database for fragile countries you work with and possibly existing engagements?
Is there
a database?
So, okay, so that's an interesting question. So at UN Capital Development Fund, what we do is, and then if you go to our corporate website, we do have a number of case studies. The way we the way we retain the work that we do and how we work in the different countries and how we integrate or introduce our intervention is more on the case studies that we have. And the case studies actually present very concrete outcomes in terms of what is the primary objective, what type of instruments did we deploy, who are the partners that we worked with, who are the target beneficiaries that have benefited from our intervention. So our database, the database that we have is more or less coined as case studies, concrete case studies that highlights and illustrates our work, highlights and illustrates our mandates, and it enables us to use the results from these case studies as a positive demonstration effect, and also ensure that other countries and other partners that are exploring intervention from UNCDF can see how we work and see how our capital mandate is put at work, and it's easy for us to replicate our intervention and our mandates across different countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. On behalf of UNEP, I want to thank you for being here, for enriching this conversation with your interventions. And I'd like to finalize these panels stating that finance is what turns ambition into concrete actions, and what turns concrete actions into scalable measures able to make a real impact on climate change. Thank you so much. I'm going to invite Mireille Atala to give the closing remarks. Thank you, Mireille.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you also for still being here, despite the fact that we're running over time. It's a great pleasure for me when I arrived to see that it was such a full room. I will not attempt to summarize what has been said in the different panels. You will see behind me some of the names and contacts and emails of the teams that you can follow up with if you need more information and if you would like to be engaged and involved going forward. So maybe just as a very short sum up of this event, just to repeat, our executive director is that carbon markets are one tool in the toolbox, and they are not a silver bullet. That being said, carbon markets can deliver more than just carbon, including addressing some of the social inequities, nature-related issues, and sustainable development. And they also can shift the dial on climate ambition. But in order for that dial to shift, we need two things. We need integrity and operations. So balancing between these two dimensions and these two aspects will be absolutely key. From the panels, we also heard that we must have partnerships. It's not a luxury, it's not something that we could potentially do, it's something that we absolutely must do, because to address those silos that private and public, different sectors, technical dimensions have been working in, unless we work together on conceiving solutions from the onset, we will waste a lot of time, and time that we do not have. We also need innovation, and we've heard that from the insurance dimension. We need addressing perception of risk, but we also need a commitment to address some of the systemic risks that apply to any market and will therefore apply to the carbon market as well. Carbon market by itself cannot release or relieve those systemic risks or address those systemic risks. So unless this is done as well, carbon markets will not play out, will not deliver. And we also need economies of scale. One such example is the issue of registries. I think that one of the key messages is that carbon markets are complex, and we cannot oversimplify complexity, but what we can do is unpack complexity. And events such as the one that we had here today help us do that and help us, come together, reflect together, contrast perspectives, maybe debate, hopefully sometimes also vividly, so that those debates help us construct those markets in a way that in the current context and trajectory of temperature overshoot helps us deploy carbon markets within a everything, everywhere, all at once philosophy, because we don't have time and we have to deliver on our climate commitments. Thank you very much, and please don't hesitate to contact the team for any further follow-up.